Good morning. Thanks for taking the time to listen or watch this message, the third in the series in the series called At His Feet, where we're going on a journey looking at encounters that people had at the feet of Jesus. People came to Jesus in the Gospels for all sorts of reasons, with all sorts of needs. And in certain cases, it records that they were at his feet. They brought many things to Jesus's feet, and Jesus touched their lives. And I believe that as we go on the journey through this series, that you too, if you choose to come to Jesus's feet, he will touch your life as well. Recently, we've looked at how Mary and Martha brought their grief to Jesus's feet when their brother Lazarus died. There's one example there, and today we're going to look at another situation where someone brought something to Jesus's feet, and the person in the story we're looking at today brought thankfulness to Jesus's feet. It is important to be thankful. It is important to have a heart of gratitude. As Pastor Ray, our late pastor, used to say, have an attitude of gratitude. And we're going to look at a passage in Luke chapter 17, starting in verse 11, running through to verse 19, where Jesus healed 10 lepers, 10 men who suffered with the skin disease leprosy. Let's read the passage together. Now, on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus travelled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." When he saw them, he said, "Go, show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were cleansed. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. And Jesus asked, "Were not all the 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well." A pretty short, sharp story, a collection of a few verses, but they contain so much. And there's so much in there to teach us about having an attitude of thankfulness. Just to set the scene and the context, we arrive in the story where there's 10 men, and we read that they're outside the village when they meet Jesus. Jesus is on his way, is in the north of Israel, is on the borderlands with Samaria, and he enters this village, the name of which we don't know. And there's a group of 10 men who are outside the village. They meet Jesus as he's stepping in, as he's on his way, on his approach to the village, and these 10 men see Jesus. With leprosy, you were banished, you were isolated and cut off from your family and your friends. Leprosy was a feared disease at the time. Skin diseases of all sorts and all kinds without cure were the people suffering with them were put out of the village, put out of community and isolated as a way to try and contain the disease, because it was feared and no one knew what the cure was. Some regarded leprosy as God's judgment and punishment on that individual. And so these men, put yourself in their position, ostracized and isolated, cut off and lonely perhaps, and missing family and friends, and they're left with no hope and no help. They're on the edge of the village, they're outside of community. We see examples today of leper colonies in certain parts of the world where they were isolated and cut off in a similar way. A few years ago now, Amy and I enjoyed a holiday in Crete in the Mediterranean, and at the eastern end of the island there was an island just off the main island of Crete, called Spinalonga, and it used to function as a leper colony where lepers would be shipped out or sent out by boat to this island offshore, a short way offshore, where they could be contained and kept apart from the rest of community. Community didn't want to know them. The villagers didn't want to know these people. They were banished and cut off. The villagers were trying to keep themselves safe and healthy, and the lepers were ostracized. They stood at a distance and welcomed Jesus. There's a great sense in this passage, in this story, of distance, of separation, of isolation. And the men stood at a distance and called out to Jesus. They had to call out in a loud voice, perhaps, to make themselves heard over the distance, over the land, the ground that separated them from this Jesus that they'd heard about. So these men were in a sorry state, in an isolated situation when they encountered Jesus, and in their desperation they called out to him. They made their voices carry over some distance, but they were desperate. This perhaps was their only chance where they could meet Jesus and encounter him. This was perhaps their only chance where they could receive his help and hopefully his healing. This Jesus who had healed others, perhaps he could heal them. This Jesus who had helped others, perhaps he could help them. This Jesus who had saved others, perhaps he could save them from their sorry situation, from their helplessness. They were desperate. They stood at a distance and they were desperate, and they shouted out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. Have pity on us." Although they were distant and although they were desperate, they demonstrated faith in their shouting. They called out to Jesus, Master. They demonstrated a dependence on Jesus. Perhaps he was their last resort. If Jesus didn't come their way again, they might be stuck in this banished, isolated group on the edge of the village, outside of the village perimeter, for the rest of their lives. Perhaps this would be their one and only chance to be healed. There's a bit of context for us there to help us understand the gravity of the situation that these men experienced, or these men were in, the situation that they were in. And it says that Jesus indeed took pity on them. He reached out to them. He heard their cry. His heart went out to them, and he saw them, and he said, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." Go and show yourselves in accordance with the law of the day, in accordance with the Jewish law. Go and show yourself to the priests. There's a test there for these men. They perhaps were expecting Jesus to come close to them and to reach out and touch them as he'd done for others, showing himself to be above the disease and above the law. But Jesus in this situation said, go and show yourselves to the priests. Jesus works differently in different situations. It's not a case of one size fits all. But Jesus used many methods and many strategies to bring healing. And in this case, he said to the men, go and show yourselves. There's a test there of faith for these men. Did they really believe that Jesus would heal them? He perhaps wasn't working in the way they expected him to. But as they went, they were cleansed. They took the test on. They did as Jesus instructed, and as they went, they experienced incredible healing, where their skin condition was restored, where they were made well. The 10 men in their leprosy, in their desperation, took Jesus at his word and obeyed. And there's a great test for us in this. Will we take Jesus at his word? Will we do what he's asking us to do? Will we obey? Will we go when he says go? It may not be how we expected him to work, but will we continue to obey and trust him? And the story continues that having received the healing, one man from the 10 comes back to Jesus. One man. 1 out of 10, 10%, if you will, just one individual out of the 10 comes back to Jesus' feet, and he, having seen and experienced God's healing, comes back and he praises God in a loud voice, and he throws himself at Jesus' feet, and he's thankful. A beautiful, beautiful image of a saved person, a healed person, of a life touched and transformed by God's love and God's power. A great response there modelled for us. Loud praise, throwing ourselves at his feet with an attitude of thankfulness. And that's what I'd like to look at this morning and focus on in this passage, is the thankfulness of this one man. Thankfulness. You know, I had to learn some lessons about thankfulness as I've grown up. When I was younger, when I was a child in my mum and dad's house, whenever we had a birthday or received Christmas presents, we were encouraged and almost required to write a letter of thanks to the sender, to the giver. It wasn't easy for us, me and my siblings. We wanted to play with our toys, there were other things to do, but we were encouraged and taught and modelled to us what it meant to be thankful, what it meant, how important it was to be thankful for what we had received. And those lessons have never left me. Those lessons, and I'm grateful for them now, as I too am learning to be a dad and learning to teach my son the way to go. I'm remembering the lessons I was taught as a child. The importance of thankfulness, the importance of showing your gratitude when you've received something from someone. Many hours were spent writing out the letters, practicing handwriting, thinking of things to say. Effort was put in to demonstrate my thankfulness, and I see that here as well. You know, it's important in the Bible to be thankful. There's many verses through the Bible where disciples, followers of Jesus, are encouraged to be thankful, where thankfulness is demonstrated and taught. And I've picked out a few for us this morning. In Psalm 100 verse 4, it says, "Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise." Psalm 95 verse 2 says, "Let us come before him with thanksgiving." Psalm 136 verse 1 says, "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, and his love endures forever." Thankfulness drips off the pages of the Psalms. It's synonymous with giving praise to God. Thanksgiving and praise go hand in hand. And thankfulness appears as an instruction, as a teaching to the churches in the New Testament letters. Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 18, "In everything give thanks, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus." In everything. And in Colossians 3 verse 15, Paul simply writes, "Be thankful." Having an attitude of gratitude is a fundamental part of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. To live with a heart of thanks, an attitude of gratitude. And this one leper who came back to give thanks, in his actions and in his contact with Jesus, I see three benefits of thanksgiving, of adopting an attitude of gratitude, of being thankful, having a thankful heart. I see three benefits in this passage. The first one is that thanksgiving and being thankful brings us closer. Being thankful brings us closer. You know, when I wrote those letters, thanking relatives and friends for presents and gifts when I was a child, I was brought closer to them in my relationship. Our friendship was closer. My heart was drawn closer to them as I appreciated what they had done for me when they didn't even have to, when they showed their generosity to me. When I stopped to think about that, I was brought closer to them. And in this passage, I see how this one leper, in his thankfulness, comes closer to Jesus. Remember, at the start of this passage, we looked at how the 10 lepers were forced into isolation as a strategy for dealing with that disease in that day. They were cut off. They had to stand at a distance and shout to Jesus. And they went to the priests to be healed. The contact with Jesus was at a distance and minimal. But having been healed, with an attitude of thankfulness, thankfulness is working in this leper's heart, and it's drawing him, and he's being wooed back to Jesus to demonstrate his love and his thanks to him. He's brought closer to Jesus. He throws himself at Jesus' feet. A beautiful image, a beautiful picture of a thankful heart. How are you today in your thankfulness towards God? Are you at a distance? Are there things that are keeping you at a distance from God? Stop and pause for a moment and think of the ways that God has blessed and graced your life. And start to think about how God has done so much for you. And if you're struggling, if you're feeling at a distance from God this morning, try adopting some thankfulness and some gratitude, and see that it will bring you closer back to the feet of Jesus. There's a passage in Ephesians chapter 2 verse 13 where again I see how thankfulness brings us closer to Jesus. And in this passage, Paul is writing and he's talking about how the hope of Jesus was initially for the Jews, but has been widened, and the Gentiles are recipients of God's grace and favour. And he says in Ephesians chapter 2 that you who were once far off, this is Ephesians 2 and verse 13, you who were once far away, now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near through the blood of Christ. What a great picture of what Jesus has done for us. We who were once far away, like the lepers, distant, cut off and isolated in our sin. We who were once far off, ostracized, sick with our sin, have been brought near through the blood of Christ. Thankfulness brings us closer to God, to his heart, and to his love. The second observation I see about thankfulness is not only does it bring us closer, but thankfulness keeps us humble. These 9 lepers who did not give thanks, I wonder why they didn't give thanks to God. I wonder why they just were healed and went on their way. Perhaps they were preoccupied with catching up on the things they'd missed out on, or going to see family and friends, and they'd forgotten the source of their healing, the one who had made all things well for them. Perhaps they were all Jews. We read in this passage that the one who returned to give thanks was a Samaritan. Now, if you know much about the Samaritans, you'll know that they were regarded as inferior by the Jewish people. The Jews regarded themselves as superior because they had kept the law and maintained the places of worship, whereas the Samaritans had compromised by their standards, by their faith, by their conduct, and as a result there was this tension and this tension between the Jews and the Samaritans. The one Samaritan in the story comes to give thanks, but the 9, the inference in the passage is that the 9 were Jews. Perhaps they had a sense of entitlement. Perhaps they expected to be healed because they were God's people. Perhaps they had expectations on what God should do for them. You know, God's healing and God's touch on our lives is all because of his grace. God gifted Jesus gifted healing to these men, and he has gifted things to our lives. We should remember this and maintain a heart of thanks towards him. It's a dangerous place to become, for us to become or come to a place where we have a sense of entitlement of what God could and should do for us. We should always adopt a position of thankfulness and gratitude for what God has done. It says in James chapter 4 and verse 6 that God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. Let's remain humble in our thankfulness. Let's never forget what God has done for us. Let's never lose the wonder of God's love, remembering how far off and at a distance we were, but because of his healing touch and his love and his grace in our lives, we who were once far off have been brought close through the blood of Christ. It's important to say thank you for the gifts that we receive, and it's important to remain humble because we haven't done anything to earn God's grace. We haven't done anything to earn his gift of grace to our lives. Let's remember this and not become proud, live with a sense of entitlement, but let's keep humble and walk humbly before God, remembering all he's done for us is a gift of grace. And the third observation about thankfulness I see, not only does thankfulness bring us closer, not only does thankfulness keep us humble, but thankfulness takes us deeper as well. In coming closer and in remaining humble, we see that this one leper who was healed in Luke 17, he came and he threw himself at Jesus' feet and he praised God and thanked him. And Jesus then speaks and communicates with this one leper. And he says to him at the end of the story, "Rise and go, your faith has made you well." You know, if we are thankful, it brings us to a place in our relationship with God where we go even deeper and he reveals and teaches and shows us even more about himself and what he's capable of doing. The 9 who didn't come and say thanks, yes, they received their physical healing, but they missed out. This one leper who came closer to Jesus, who came back and said thank you, experienced greater intimacy with Jesus. He experienced greater wonder, awe and wonder in his life. He had revelation that came to him. He experienced more comforting words of Jesus. He encountered Jesus in a way that the 9 others did not encounter him. He went deeper in his relationship with Jesus. And this morning, my challenge to you is, will you go deeper in your relationship with Jesus? To do so, it means to adopt a position of thankfulness, remembering that we are just recipients of his grace and his mercy. We don't have a sense of entitlement or right. God has graced us with his saving touch and with his presence. So let's be thankful today. In our thankfulness, let's come closer to him. In our thankfulness, let's remain humble. And in our thankfulness, let's go deeper. Spend time at his feet today and be thankful. God bless you.